In this video, I'll talk about the predefined column classes that are used to provide cell widths for a given media query breakpoint. Before we jump in and talk about that, I want to make a quick, simple observation with regards to row height from the previous lesson's example, containers.html. Let's go ahead and run that again. And as you can see in the third cell, there's just not a lot of room for the text. So the text wraps to a second line, making the height of that cell larger than the other cells in that row. And as a result, it makes the entire row taller. So that, I guess, is the first point, that the row height in Bootstrap is dictated by the tallest cell in that row. Now, the ramification and the importance of that is that you can see there's a disparity in the heights of cells, which might cause layout issues because we might need all three of those cells to be the same height. So how do we do that? That's where some of the optional Flexbox features might come into play. But at this point, let's just observe this in general, and then we'll look for solutions if we need them from an aesthetic standpoint going forward. All right, but the key here is that the row height is equal to the height of the tallest cell in that given row. All right, so let's move on from there, and let's talk about what happens. Let's run the application one more time. Sorry, and this time, I want to recall your memory that we got to a certain point at which the cells moved from a horizontal orientation to a vertical orientation. All right. When I increase the width, we get the horizontal. When we decrease the width, we get the vertical orientation. Now, unfortunately, because I'm working on a desktop computer, I often confuse myself thinking that Bootstrap is actually starting with this larger size, and it will only go to this more vertical orientation whenever there's simply not enough space. However, I've actually got it backwards. Remember, Bootstrap is a mobile-first responsive framework. So, in other words, by default, the cells are always stacked vertically to begin with. Then, if there's enough width available horizontally, and based on the definitions that we add to the given cells, then those cells might be stacked horizontally. Those widths are defined by the various media queries at certain media query breakpoints. So to kind of illustrate these ideas and understand them more fully, I want to add another HTML page to our project. And we're going to name this predefined grid classes.html. And I'm going to go to my template, grab all the code from there, and then go to my new web page and paste it over the top of what I currently have. All right. Now, to illustrate the idea that we're actually going to start in a vertical fashion, I'll go ahead and remove the classes completely. And so when we run the application, notice that without any further instruction, Bootstrap will put all of the cells for a given row and arrange them in a vertical fashion. And that the only way that we can adjust this is to, at a certain breakpoint, say, if we get to this screen size, then I want to move these cells into a more horizontal fashion. So that's why whenever we then were able to go, for example, and use this MD representing a specific media query, the medium media query, at that point then it said, hey, there's enough room. We hit the medium breakpoint. Let's go ahead and move those into their own, onto a horizontal line. And from that point on, anything larger than that will also stay in that same configuration of widths. All right, so I think that's the first thing you need to keep in mind. Now, what if we wanted to have the the same proportion regardless of whether we were working on a phone or on the largest possible monitor. We could use and start with the smallest of the breakpoint media query breakpoints, which is extra small. So in other words, even if we start off here at the smallest possible size I can resize my window, notice that this proportion of 6, 4, and 2, in other words, half of the 12, a third of the 12, and a sixth of the 12 will always be represented even if we make it out to the largest possible size as we resize the window, okay? So again, the moral of the story there is that by default, Bootstrap will stack everything in a vertical fashion in a given row until we give it instructions and say at this breakpoint, start to stack items in a horizontal fashion given these proportions. Now we can define at every breakpoint what we want to use in terms of column proportions. And there are 5 media queries in Bootstrap 4. There is the XS, which represents extra small. And then there is SM for small. Then there's MD for medium. Then there's LG for large. And then there's XL for extra large, all right? And so we'll talk about the specific sizes in the next video. Let's go back and just hit XS here. But this is where there's one fundamental difference between Bootstrap version 3 and version 4. In Bootstrap 3, there were only 4 of these media query breakpoints, and there's a 5th one now added in Bootstrap 4. All right, and the sizes don't quite line up either. We'll talk about that in the next video. And in the transition from version 3 to version 4, that new XL was added. The new XL media query breakpoint was added, extra large breakpoint. However, this is actually the same size as the LG previously, and the LG is the same size as the MD previously, and so on. So essentially what they did was add a new size, the smallest size, XS, and then what was previously extra small got moved up to small. What was small now is moved up to medium, and so on. Okay, so again, this will become clearer in the next video. But essentially this new definition for extra small allowed for smaller screen resolutions to have its own distinct styling. So now what happens at the other end of the spectrum if I were to define these with XL instead? Now just kind of keep in your mind what you think is going to happen. And then we'll run the application. And so here we are, and maybe it would be best to start off at the smallest possible size. Again, Bootstrap starts with everything stacked vertically until it reaches a definition for a breakpoint, in this case the XL breakpoint, where it can actually stack things in a horizontal fashion. Okay, it's important to understand how Bootstrap is actually working and starting at with things stacked vertically, and then if it has a definition for the extra small, it'll use that. If it doesn't, it'll say, well, how about as we resize and go to small, go to medium, go to large, go to extra large. Okay, let's just go ahead and resize all this back. Now, the other thing that I want to kind of talk about is the fact that you have complete flexibility to treat the widths differently for each media query. You can even hide cells depending on the current media query, and we'll talk about that with some utility classes coming up. But here's what we'll do, just to kind of prove this point. I'm going to go from the extra small to the small, and the only difference that I'm going to do here is that by adding a second definition, this time for the small breakpoint, I'm going to say when we get to small, make them all evenly sized. However, when it's extra small, you can split them up with half, 1/3, 1/6. Okay, so let's see this in action now. And we'll start again at the smallest size, which is what we've been working with, the half, the 1/3 and the 1/6, but when we get to the small size, notice that the proportions will change, and they're equally 1/3 of the width of the row. Okay. Now, typically, actually, we would probably do this the other way around, like so, because you typically do things that are more visually interesting in the larger sizes. All right. So let's rerun the application, and this time now, when we're in the extra small form factor, everything is divvied up the same in this case. And then as we get to the larger small form factor, things start going into that 1/2, 1/3, 1/6 sizing, and all the way through the largest possible width of the window. Okay, great. And so we'll wind up using this this frequently whenever we're building our own applications. We'll often want to have complete control at every breakpoint, or at least many breakpoints, for how we actually want to treat a given cell in terms of its width. So here, let's just do the opposite now and swap the sizes around when we hit the large and larger breakpoints. So here we go. So here we start with everything in the extra small breakpoint, and now we're moving to the small breakpoint, and you can see we have what we're used to, the 1/2, 1/3, and 1/6. But now when we get to the large, we'll swap the proportions where we have now 1/3, or rather a 1/6, 1/3, and then 1/2. Okay. All right. So in the next lesson, we're going to talk at length about the various media query breakpoints that were defined in Bootstrap and how media queries work. And we'll briefly talk about the units of measure that are used as well. All right, so we'll pick it back up in the next lesson. See you there.